They told him the fire was no longer his responsibility. They told him the dog was no longer fit to serve. They told both of them their mission was over.
Keep moving, hang in there.
But when one man was trapped beneath a collapsing roof, God did not call the strongest or the fastest.
Barks of a German
He called
shepherd.
the ones who were still willing to walk forward. A broken seal, an injured German shepherd. One choice that would cost them everything they once were. This is not a story about surviving the fire. It is a story about why God sometimes lets us be wounded so we can become the reason someone else lives. Morning settled uneasily over the harbor town of Port Townsend, Washington. Low clouds pressed against the sky, and the damp air carried the mixed scent of saltwater and old wood from the docks. The rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving the pavement dark and slick, reflecting the dull glow of streetlights that had not yet gone out. Fishing boats rocked quietly at their moorings, and the town moved with the subdued rhythm of a place that had learned to live without urgency. Silas Grayson walked along the harbor road with steady, unhurried steps. He was 41, tall, broad-shouldered, built with the restrained strength of someone who no longer needed to prove it. His hair was cut short, dark with gray beginning to show at the temples. His face was calm, unreadable, shaped by years of discipline rather than comfort. He wore a worn olive jacket, a plain shirt, dark pants, and boots softened by long use. There was nothing about him that invited attention, yet his posture carried the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to responsibility. Silas had once been a Navy SEAL. Now he lived alone near the edge of town and kept his days deliberately simple. He spoke little, avoided crowds, and walked every morning along the harbor, not for exercise alone, but to keep his thoughts from settling too deeply. Beside him walked Hawk. Hawk was a German shepherd, 7 years old, large and solid, his black and brown coat dulled slightly by age. A faint stiffness marked his right hind leg, noticeable only if one looked closely. His ears stood alert, his eyes dark and focused, always scanning. He had once been a K9, trained for search and detection, precise and dependable. Injury had ended his service early, and Silas had taken him in without ceremony. Hawk had adapted to civilian life quietly, asking for nothing beyond proximity. They were nearing the old pier when Silas noticed the smell shift. Smoke cut through the harbor air, sharp and unmistakable. Ahead, beyond a row of storage buildings, a column of dark smoke rose into the low clouds. Orange light flickered against the metal walls of an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Sirens followed, distant but approaching. Hawk stopped. His body tensed, ears forward, nose lifted. He did not bark. He simply waited. Silas slowed, his attention narrowing. He changed direction without comment, moving toward the warehouse as figures began gathering along the road. Dock workers stood watching, faces tight. A woman in a thin raincoat held her phone with shaking hands. Someone shouted toward the smoke, then fell silent. By the time Silas reached the edge of the scene, flames were visible at a side entrance, feeding on debris inside. Police cars arrived in quick succession. Officers moved to push people back, voices sharp with urgency. One officer paused when he saw Silas. His name was Mark Delaney, early 30s, compact build, eyes alert and strained. His uniform sleeves were already darkened with soot. "You can't be here," Delaney called out. Silas stopped but did not retreat. "Is anyone inside?" he asked. Delaney hesitated. "One person unaccounted for. Fire crews are delayed. The structure's unstable." Metal creaked from within the warehouse, a warning sound that carried even over the sirens. Delaney glanced at Hawk again, his expression shifting. "Is the dog trained?" he asked. "He was," Silas replied. Another officer shouted that engines were still minutes away. Delaney swore under his breath, weighing options he did not like. Silas watched the building, calculating without haste. He had promised himself he was done stepping into situations like this. He had meant it, but the weight in his chest told him some choices did not disappear simply because one wanted them to. Hawk leaned forward slightly, focused on the smoke-filled entrance. Delaney exhaled. 5 minutes, he said. If it shifts, you're out. Silas nodded once. No words were needed. Heat pressed against them as they approached the warehouse. Smoke thickened the air. Hawk stayed close, moving in quiet coordination, every sense alert. Together they crossed the threshold, leaving the gray harbor morning behind and stepping into the unstable darkness where the call no one wanted had been answered. The air inside the warehouse was heavier than Silas expected, thick with smoke that clung low and refused to rise. Light filtered in through broken panels in the roof, fractured and uneven, illuminating drifting ash that moved like slow snow. The space was vast but disordered. Rows of crates collapsed into each other, metal shelving warped by heat, wooden beams darkened and cracking as the fire advanced somewhere deeper within. Every sound carried too far, footsteps echoing where silence should have been, the structure answering back with soft groans that warned without explaining. Silas paused just beyond the entrance. He did not rush forward. He never had. He took in the layout, the angles, the debris patterns that hinted at where the building had already begun to fail. Years of training surfaced without effort, not as memories, but as instinct. He crouched slightly, keeping his weight centered, and raised one hand, not a command, but a signal Hawk recognized immediately. Hawk moved ahead by half a step, nose low, body aligned with Silas's path. The dog's breathing was controlled, his focus absolute. The stiffness in his hind leg did not slow him yet, though Silas could feel it through the careful way Hawk placed his weight. They had done this before, long ago, in different buildings, under different skies. The environment had changed, the rhythm had not. Somewhere inside, something fell. The sound echoed sharply, followed by a hollow thud that vibrated through the floor. Silas felt it through his boots and adjusted his stance, shifting away from a sagging section of concrete dusted with ash. He marked the spot mentally and moved on. "Maintenance," Silas called out, his voice low but firm, shaped to carry without wasting air. "If you can hear me, answer." No response. The smoke thickened as they moved deeper, forcing Silas to slow his breathing, keeping it shallow and deliberate. His eyes burned, but he ignored it. Panic wasted oxygen. Discipline conserved it. Hawk stopped again, ears flicking, head turning slightly to the left. His nose lifted, testing the air. Silas followed the cue. He angled toward a partially collapsed aisle between two rows of shelving, one side slanted inward where a support beam had cracked. The heat there was stronger, pulsing in waves that warned of fire moving closer. He hesitated only long enough to judge the risk. They advanced. A cough broke the silence, weak, distant, unmistakably human. Silas froze, then raised his hand again. Hawk's posture sharpened, attention locking onto the sound. The cough came again, followed by a faint, hoarse attempt at speech that dissolved into breathless wheezing. "Hold on," Silas called. "We're coming to you." The man was trapped beneath a fallen beam near the far wall, partially shielded by a stack of crates that had collapsed just enough to create a pocket of space. He was in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, but worn thin by years of physical work. His face was streaked with soot, eyes wide and glassy with fear. One leg was pinned, twisted at an angle that made Silas wince. "My name's Tom," the man said between shallow breaths. I couldn't get out." Tom's voice shook, not just from pain but from the dawning realization of how close the fire had come. His hands trembled as he clutched at the concrete floor, knuckles scraped raw. Silas crouched beside him, careful to stay clear of unstable debris. "You did the right thing staying put," he said calmly. "We're going to get you out." Hawk positioned himself instinctively on Tom's other side, body angled to block falling debris, eyes never leaving Silas's face. The dog's presence had an immediate effect. Tom's breathing slowed slightly, his focus shifting away from the fire and onto the solid warmth beside him. Silas tested the beam with one hand. It shifted, but not enough. Too much weight, too much risk to lift outright. He scanned for leverage, spotting a length of metal pipe nearby, half buried under ash. He retrieved it carefully and wedged it beneath the beam, using the collapsed crate as a pivot point. The structure answered with a deep creak. Silas paused, listening. He waited for the sound to settle, for the building to declare its intentions. The fire crackled somewhere behind them. Closer now, its heat pressing harder against his back. "On my count," Silas said, more to himself than to Tom. He leaned into the pipe, applying steady pressure, not force. The beam lifted just enough. "Hawk," he said softly. Hawk responded immediately, shifting forward, using his body to brace the space as Silas created it. It was not something Hawk had been trained to do specifically, but it was something he understood: hold, protect, endure. Silas reached for Tom's leg, easing it free inch by inch. Tom gasped, pain flashing across his face, but he did not scream. He clenched his jaw and nodded, trusting the stranger and the dog without question. Another crack echoed overhead. Silas felt it this time, felt the vibration travel through the beam, through the floor, into his bones. The building was changing. Time was thinning. "We need to move," Silas said. He shifted his grip, sliding one arm under Tom's shoulder, preparing to drag him clear. Hawk adjusted again, stepping back to give space, then repositioning himself at Silas's side, ready to move when Silas moved. Smoke swirled thickly around them now, blurring the edges of the room. The heat surged, no longer distant. From somewhere above, a sharp metallic snap cut through the noise. Silas looked up just as dust and fragments began to fall from the ceiling. He tightened his hold on Tom, bracing himself for what came next, knowing the choice to enter had already been made, and that whatever followed would not ask for permission. The sound came first. Not the roar of flames or the hiss of burning wood, but a sharp metallic crack that cut through the air with unnatural clarity. Silas felt it before he understood it, a vibration traveling through the beam he was bracing, up his arms, into his shoulders. The warehouse shifted around them, subtle at first, like a breath drawn too deep. "Stay with me," Silas said to Tom, tightening his grip as he dragged him another inch clear of the fallen beam. Tom nodded weakly, teeth clenched, eyes wide with pain and fear. His breathing was shallow now, uneven, each inhale scraping against smoke and panic. Hawk stood close, body angled toward the ceiling rather than the fire, ears flicking as debris began to fall in fine, gritty bursts. His training took over without hesitation. This was not a place for thought. This was a place for reaction. Another crack sounded overhead, louder this time. Dust poured down in sheets, turning the air opaque. Silas glanced up, just long enough to see the ceiling bow inward, the metal framework twisting under its own weight. "Move," Silas said, more instinct than command. The floor lurched. The section of roof above them gave way with a thunderous collapse. A mass of concrete, metal, and burning debris dropped in a violent cascade, faster than Silas could pull Tom clear. There was no time to calculate, no space to retreat. Hawk reacted, not as a conscious choice, but as the result of years spent learning one truth above all others. When something falls, you place yourself between danger and the one who cannot move. Hawk lunged forward, body slamming into Tom's side, forcing him sideways just enough to clear the direct path of the collapse. The movement was abrupt, imperfect, but it changed the angle. The impact came immediately after. A slab of concrete struck Hawk across the hindquarters, pinning his back legs beneath it. At the same instant, a fragment of twisted metal slammed into Silas's shoulder, driving him sideways into the floor. Pain exploded through his left side, white-hot and disorienting, stealing the breath from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, vision blurring as debris rained down around them. The noise was overwhelming. Metal screamed. Wood snapped. Fire surged, feeding on fresh oxygen. Somewhere close, something collapsed completely, sending a wave of heat and pressure through the space. Silas tried to move and found that his body did not respond the way it should. His left arm lay at an angle that felt wrong, heavy, and distant. A sharp ache radiated from his spine, each attempt to shift, sending a bolt of pain through his back that left him gasping. "Hawk," he tried to say, but the word came out broken, lost in the chaos. Hawk did not bark. He lay partially buried, chest pressed against the floor, breathing fast and shallow. One hind leg was trapped beneath the concrete slab, twisted unnaturally. His ears flattened, not in fear, but in concentration, as if he were still listening for instructions that would never come. Tom cried out, the sound raw and panicked. He had been thrown clear enough to survive the collapse, but fear surged back as he saw the damage around him. He tried to crawl toward Silas and Hawk, but his injured leg betrayed him, sending him sprawling. "I'm here," Silas managed, dragging air into his lungs. He forced himself to roll onto his side, ignoring the pain screaming through his body. His vision swam, edges darkening, but he focused on Hawk's shape through the smoke. Another section of the ceiling groaned ominously. Silas knew then that the building was no longer stable in any sense that mattered. The choice to enter had been made minutes ago. The cost was being paid now. He reached out with his right hand, fingers trembling, and touched Hawk's neck. The dog flinched but did not pull away. His breathing stuttered, then steadied slightly at the contact. "It's okay," Silas whispered, though he did not know if it was true. He did not know if any of them were getting out without help, or at all. The smoke thickened, pressing down like a weight. Sirens wailed faintly somewhere beyond the walls, distorted by distance and debris. The world narrowed to heat, pain, and the simple fact that they were still alive, at least for the moment. Above them, the warehouse settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that followed violence and promised more. The moment had passed. Nothing would be the same again. Silas came back to the world in pieces. At first, there was only weight, firm and unmoving beneath him. Not the brutal hardness of concrete, but something flatter, narrower, wrapped in thin fabric. His body registered the difference before his mind did. The air felt cleaner, sharper. It stung his lungs in a way that was almost gentle compared to smoke. Light pressed against his closed eyelids. When he finally opened his eyes, the ceiling above him was white, interrupted by long fluorescent panels and narrow metal rails. The steady hum of machines replaced the roar of fire. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped in a slow, patient rhythm. A hospital? The realization settled without relief. Relief would have required energy he did not have. Pain followed awareness almost immediately. It bloomed across his chest and down his spine, deep and unyielding, turning every breath into a careful negotiation. His left arm lay strapped close to his body, heavy and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He tried to move and stopped, instinct warning him not to push further. Memory rushed back then, uninvited and sharp, heat collapsing inward, the sound of metal tearing, the moment Hawk disappeared beneath falling debris. Hawk? Silas turned his head too quickly. The room tilted, nausea rising, and a hand pressed gently against his shoulder, guiding him back. "Easy," a voice said. Female. Calm. "You're safe. You're in the hospital." Silas swallowed, his throat dry and raw. "The dog?" he managed, the words scraping out of him. "Where is he?" The nurse hesitated, just long enough for fear to tighten in Silas's chest. She was middle-aged, practical, with tired eyes softened by experience. "He's here," she said carefully. "Veterinary trauma team brought him in with you. They're working on him now." Silas closed his eyes, a breath shuddering out of him. The tightness in his chest did not disappear, but it loosened enough for him to breathe again. Time slipped strangely after that. He drifted in and out of awareness, voices fading in and out around him. Doctors spoke in measured tones. Words like fracture, spinal trauma, and stable for now floated past without fully landing. None of it mattered as much as the single question still waiting for its answer. Eventually, the room grew quieter. The nurse returned, pulling a chair closer to his bed. "He made it through surgery," she said. "Your dog. He's alive." Silas stared at her, unblinking. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, as if his body needed proof that it was allowed to continue. "Can I see him?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied gently. "But he's close. They're keeping him sedated." He fought hard. Silas nodded once. That part did not surprise him. The nurse adjusted his blanket, then hesitated. "Most people don't ask about anyone else when they wake up," she said quietly. "You did?" Silas said nothing. There was nothing to explain. Later, how much later he could not tell, he was wheeled down a corridor, the ceiling lights passing overhead in a slow shows of white and shadow. As they paused near a set of glass doors, Silas turned his head slightly. Through the glass he saw another room. Hawk lay on a padded table, surrounded by unfamiliar equipment. Tubes and wires traced along his body, his chest rising and falling in a steady, assisted rhythm. His fur had been cleaned where they could clean it, bandages wrapped carefully around his hindquarters. A veterinarian leaned close, checking monitors, her movements precise and focused. Silas felt something inside him break open then, not loudly, not violently, but enough to let air back in. Hawk was still here. Silas's eyes closed, tears gathering without permission. He did not wipe them away. He let them fall, silent and unobserved, soaking into the pillow beneath his head. For the first time since the warehouse collapsed, he allowed himself to think beyond the next breath. He did not pray for strength. He did not pray for recovery. He prayed for time. Time for the dog who had stepped forward without hesitation. Time for both of them to learn what came after survival. The machines continued their quiet vigil. Somewhere down the hall, Hawk breathed on. And in the space between pain and exhaustion, Silas Grayson finally let himself rest. The news did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, spaced carefully apart, as if the hospital itself understood that some truths needed room to land. Silas Grayson learned first that the man from the warehouse had survived. A police officer came by mid-morning, uniform neat but eyes dulled by exhaustion, and delivered the update without ceremony. The maintenance worker had been pulled free after the collapse, transported in critical condition, operated on through the night. He had lost blood, broken bones, burned skin, but his heart had not stopped. He was alive. He asked who went in after him, the officer said. We told him. Silas nodded once. He did not smile. Survival was not something to celebrate quietly in a hospital room. It was something to respect. Later that day, when the noise of the ward settled into its afternoon lull, the doctors arrived. There were two of them. One was an orthopedic surgeon in his early 60s, tall and narrow, his white coat hanging loosely from shoulders that had long since learned how to bear responsibility. His hair was silver, his voice calm, practiced. The other was a neurologist, younger, precise, with careful eyes and a habit of pausing before difficult sentences. They spoke to Silas as they would to anyone who had spent a life making decisions under pressure, directly, without softness that felt like pity. The damage to Silas's spine was significant. Compression fractures along the lower thoracic region, swelling near the nerves. The surgery had stabilized what could be stabilized, but it had not restored what was lost. He would walk again, most likely, though not soon and not easily. There would be pain that no medication could fully silence. Movements that once belonged to him without question would now require planning and restraint. "You won't be the same," the older doctor said, "but you won't be helpless." Silas accepted this without argument. He asked how long before he could sit unassisted. What kind of therapy would begin first? What mistakes he needed to avoid if he wanted to keep what function remained? The doctors answered. They respected the questions. When they finished, the room grew quiet. "And the dog," Silas said. The neurologist glanced toward the door. A moment later, a veterinarian entered. She was in her 40s, medium height, dark hair pulled back neatly, her posture composed in the way of someone accustomed to standing between hope and reality. Her name was Dr. Elaine Porter. She spoke clearly. Hawk had survived surgery. His injuries were extensive. Bone damage to the hind leg, ligaments torn beyond full repair. Even with rehabilitation, the strength and speed required for operational work would never return. "He'll have quality of life," she said, "but he won't work again, not in the way he used to." The word work lingered in the air. Silas felt it settle somewhere deep, heavier than the diagnosis of his own injuries. Hawk had been built for purpose, trained for it. To take that away was not just a physical loss. It was an identity being quietly closed. When the veterinarian left, Silas remained still, staring at nothing in particular. The machines continued their rhythm. The hospital moved on around him. That night, sleep refused to stay. Silas lay awake, staring into the dimness, replaying the warehouse in his mind with merciless clarity. Every step he had taken, every moment where he could have stopped, turned back, waited. He imagined the version of the morning where he and Hawk never crossed the threshold. In that version, his spine was intact. Hawk ran without pain. Life continued, narrow and controlled. And a man died beneath a fallen beam. The question returned, sharper now that it had a shape. Was it worth it? Silas did not push the thought away. He let it stay. He had lived too long with consequences to pretend otherwise. The cost was real. It would follow him for the rest of his life. It would follow Hawk for the rest of his. In the early hours before dawn, a nurse wheeled Silas slowly down the corridor for imaging. Her name was Margaret Klein, a woman in her late 50s with a solid build and a steady presence that suggested decades of night shifts and hard conversations. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice carried a quiet authority. They paused briefly near a glass partition separating the main ward from the temporary veterinary unit. Silas turned his head. Hawk lay inside, awake now, eyes half open, unfocused, but present. Bandages wrapped his hindquarters, clean and precise. His breathing was slow and steady, no longer assisted. A technician stood nearby, monitoring quietly. Silas watched him for a long moment. Hawk's eyes shifted, just slightly, and settled on him. There was no wagging tail, no attempt to move, just recognition. Something in Silas's chest tightened, then eased. He had his answer. Not the kind that erased pain or justified suffering. The kind that simply told the truth. The choice had not been fair. It had not been kind. It had been necessary. Silas closed his eyes, the weight of it settling fully at last. He would walk again, differently. Hawk would live, differently. Neither would return to what they had been. But a man would go home. That, Silas decided, was the price of doing what was right, and it was one he would carry. Morning light reached Silas Grayson gradually, not as a revelation, but as a negotiation. It slipped through the narrow hospital window, pale and cautious, resting along the edge of his bed before climbing slowly toward his chest. The machines beside him hummed with quiet persistence, their rhythm steady enough to fade into the background. His back ached in a deep, familiar way now, no longer shocking, simply present, like a truth that had settled in and decided to stay. Rehabilitation began without ceremony. There were no speeches, no promises, just schedules, measured movements, and patience disguised as routine. Silas learned quickly that progress here was not counted in miles or minutes, but in inches and seconds. Sitting upright without dizziness, standing with assistance, shifting weight without the sharp flare that stole his breath. Each small victory felt strangely heavier than the larger ones he remembered from another life. Hawk was moved into a quieter wing 2 days later, close enough that Silas could see him during escorted walks down the corridor. The dog's frame looked smaller against the padded surfaces and sterile light, his once effortless strength now contained by careful bandaging and controlled movement. His hindquarters remained immobilized, his gait uncertain when the veterinarians allowed brief assisted steps, but his eyes were alert again. Watchful, present. The fire had not taken that from him. It was during one of these slow corridor walks that Silas first noticed the change in the air around them. Patients paused when they passed. Conversations softened. A woman seated near the window, thin and stooped with age, lifted her head slightly as Hawk came into view. Her name was Eleanor Brooks, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, narrow-shouldered, silver hair cut short for convenience rather than style. She had suffered a stroke months earlier and moved through the world now with cautious effort, her confidence shaken more than her body. As Hawk passed, her hand stilled on the armrest, her breathing slowing almost imperceptibly. "He reminds me of my old shepherd," she said quietly, more to herself than to Silas. Silas nodded, unsure what to offer. Hawk's ears flicked toward her voice, his head turning just enough to acknowledge it. They continued on. Later, in the physical therapy room, Silas worked under the guidance of Daniel Reed, the therapist assigned to his recovery. Daniel was in his early 50s, tall and broad, with close-cropped hair and the posture of someone who understood both strength and its limits. Years earlier, a cycling accident had ended his competitive career and redirected his focus. It had left him patient in a way that could not be taught, firm without being dismissive. "People like you struggle here," Daniel said one afternoon as Silas completed a controlled weight shift between parallel bars. "Not because you're weak, because you're used to measuring yourself by what you can do alone." Silas exhaled slowly, sweat gathering at his temples. "And here?" "Here," Daniel said, "you measure yourself by what you don't quit." Across the room, Hawk rested on a padded mat under the supervision of a veterinary technician. His presence was not part of Silas's prescribed therapy, but no one argued against it. The dog lay quietly, chest rising and falling, his eyes tracking movement, his calm steadying the space around him. Silas began to notice patterns. Patients scheduled their sessions when Hawk would be nearby. Nurses lingered longer during routine checks. A young man with a broken leg and a restless temper sat cross-legged on the floor one afternoon, tossing a rubber ball gently toward Hawk, his movements slowing, his breathing evening out with each quiet return of the ball. The young man's name was Lucas Meyer, 22, all sharp edges and impatience, injured in a construction accident that had taken his mobility and his sense of direction in equal measure. He had arrived angry, distrustful, convinced that the world had cheated him out of momentum. When Hawk lay near him, Lucas stopped talking so much. He listened instead. Silas watched these interactions with a distance that felt intentional rather than detached. He did not guide them. He did not intervene. He simply allowed Hawk to exist as he was now, not as he had been trained to be. One afternoon, Sarah Miller stopped beside Silas's bed as he rested between sessions. She leaned lightly against the counter, arms folded, her expression thoughtful. Sarah had worked trauma wards for over a decade, her calm shaped by long nights and irreversible outcomes. She spoke carefully, but not cautiously. "You know," she said, "this wing is quieter when you two are here." Silas glanced toward the corridor where Hawk lay resting. He's not doing anything. Sarah smiled faintly. Neither are most of the people who help the most. The idea followed Silas through the day. It settled beside him during exercises, during meals, during the slow return to his room each evening. He thought of the warehouse, of movement measured in seconds, of worth proven through action. He thought of Hawk, once defined by capability, now defined by presence. That night, Eleanor Brooks approached Silas as he rested near the window. She moved carefully, leaning on a cane, her posture tentative but determined. "May I sit?" she asked. Silas nodded. "I haven't slept well since my stroke," she said, her voice steady but thin. "Today, when your dog was nearby, I did, just for a little while." Silas considered this. "He's good at staying," he said. Eleanor smiled. "So are you." The realization did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as alignment. Silas understood then that the question he had carried since the fire had already been answered, not through logic or justification, but through observation. His value had never been limited to what he could break through or carry out. Hawk's worth had never ended with the last command he followed. They were still useful, not as weapons, not as shields, but as anchors. The following morning, sunlight filled the therapy wing more fully than before, spilling across the floor in long, gentle lines. Silas moved with assistance, Hawk resting nearby, and around them the ward breathed in a quieter rhythm. No one applauded, no one named what was happening. But Silas felt it settle into place. The answer had come, not in darkness or pain, but in daylight, clear enough to be seen and steady enough to be trusted. They would not return to what they had been. They would become what was needed now. Time did not announce itself when it changed things. It moved quietly, measured in calendars pinned to corkboards and check marks scribbled beside appointments. Months passed. Winter loosened its grip on the harbor town, and the light returned with a steadiness that no longer startled Silas Grayson. He learned the limits of his back the way sailors learn the tide, by attention rather than resistance. Some mornings were stiff and unforgiving. Others allowed him a longer stride. None offered the old certainty, and he stopped asking for it. Hawk changed too. The bandages came off. The hardware remained, hidden beneath fur that grew back uneven in places. His walk never fully smoothed out, a slight hitch that marked each step, but his eyes stayed clear and alert. He learned to rest without restlessness and to move without urgency. They learned together, without instruction, how to arrive at a place and stay there. The idea did not begin as a plan. It began as a pattern. Silas noticed that people lingered when he and Hawk were present. Conversation started without prompts. Silence settled without discomfort. In a town accustomed to distance, something softened. A veteran with a cane stopped by during a morning walk and asked if he could sit for a minute. A woman with shaking hands followed them into the community clinic and stayed longer than her appointment required. Silas listened. Hawk lay down. The room breathed easier. By spring, the clinic offered them a room. It was small, with a window that faced the water and chairs that did not match. The sign on the door was hand-painted by a volunteer, simple and unadorned. No titles, no credentials, just a time and a place. Silas did not argue. He did not add anything. He learned long ago that people trusted what did not advertise itself. The first to arrive regularly was Jack Morales, a former infantryman in his late 40s with a compact build and eyes that carried too many nights. Jack moved with caution, favoring one knee, his posture tight as if bracing for something that never came. He spoke little at first. When he did, his words arrived carefully, as though each one had to earn its place. He sat across from Silas, hands folded, and stared at the floor until Hawk settled beside his chair. Then Jack's shoulders lowered. He breathed out. He stayed. Others followed. Megan Pierce came on Wednesdays. She was in her early 30s, slender, with dark hair cut short for practicality rather than style. A paramedic until an accident took her off the job, Megan carried grief like a tool she did not know where to put. She spoke quickly, laughed too soon, and apologized for everything. When Hawk rested his head near her feet, she stopped apologizing. She spoke slower. She stayed longer. On Fridays, Thomas Bell arrived with a notebook he never opened. He was 62, tall and stooped, a former dock supervisor who had lost his son years earlier and never found language that fit afterward. Thomas listened more than he spoke. He watched Hawk breathe. He nodded when others spoke. When he finally said something, it was brief and exact. Silas learned that listening did not require agreement, only presence. Silas never led the room. He did not offer advice or strategies. He sat with his back supported, hands resting loosely, and let the space do its work. When asked about his past, he answered simply. When asked about the fire, he spoke only to the point where facts ended and memory began. He did not push beyond that line, neither did anyone else. Hawk became the constant. He arrived early and left last. He chose spots instinctively, near those whose breathing was shallow or whose hands shook without reason. He did not seek attention. He did not perform. He existed. People learned his rhythms and adjusted their own. When Hawk slept, the room quieted. When he lifted his head, conversations shifted gently, as if guided by something older than intention. A retired Navy chaplain named Robert Hayes visited once and stayed. Robert was tall, lean, with white hair kept neatly trimmed, and a voice that carried warmth without pressure. He wore plain clothes and asked few questions. After one session, he pulled Silas aside. "You're not fixing anyone," Robert said. "You're giving them a place to stand while they fix themselves." Silas nodded. He understood that language. As the weeks settled into routine, the program grew without effort. No flyers, no announcements, just word of mouth and a door that opened on time. The town noticed, not with ceremony, but with trust. People brought coffee. Someone replaced a broken chair. A local carpenter fixed the window latch without asking. Silas felt the work differently than he had felt any mission before. There were no after-action reports, no metrics to measure success. Progress appeared quietly, in steadier hands, in laughter that returned without warning, in silences that no longer felt empty. He carried his pain into the room and found that it mattered less there. Hawk carried his limp and found that it mattered not at all. One afternoon, a young veteran named Caleb Wright arrived late and angry. He was 25, tall and restless, with a jaw set too tightly and eyes that moved too quickly. He spoke with sharp edges and dismissed the room with a shrug. Silas listened. Hawk did not move. Caleb stopped talking. He stared at the dog, then at Silas. "So this is it," he said. "You just sit." Silas met his gaze. "We stay." Caleb stayed too. The town never called it a program. It became known simply as the room by the water. People said it helped without explaining how. Silas did not correct them. He learned that meaning did not need instruction to function. On a clear morning near the end of summer, Silas and Hawk walked the harbor path as they always had. The water was calm. Boats moved slowly. Silas's steps were careful but confident. Hawk's gait remained uneven, but his pace matched Silas's without effort. They passed familiar faces. Heads nodded. No one stopped them. That was the point. Silas understood then that what they had built required no permanence beyond participation. It did not need recognition to exist. It needed only the choice to show up again tomorrow and the day after that. They had lost strength and certainty. They had gained time and purpose. The exchange felt fair in a way that no award ever had. Together they turned back toward the clinic, toward the room with the mismatched chairs and the open door, carrying nothing but their presence and the willingness to listen. That was enough. Morning returned to the harbor without resistance. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that did not ask to be admired, only accepted. Light spread evenly across the water, settling on boats that drifted lazily against their lines and along the concrete path that traced the edge of the docks. The town was awake, but unhurried, moving with the confidence of a place that had learned how to keep going without noise. Silas Grayson walked the harbor road with measured steps, his pace slower than it once had been, but steady in a way that no longer required thought. His back still spoke to him, especially in the mornings. But the pain had changed its tone. It was no longer a warning. It was information. He listened to it and adjusted, the way he now adjusted to most things in his life. Beside him, Hawk moved with a familiar rhythm. His gait carried a permanent unevenness, a subtle hitch that marked each step, but it did not slow him. His coat had filled back in, though the fur along his hindquarters lay slightly differently now, as if the past had left its signature there. His ears were up, his eyes calm and observant, scanning the world not for threats, but for presence. He walked close to Silas without crowding him, matching pace by instinct alone. They passed the old pier where fishermen were unloading their catch, the smell of salt and diesel mixing with the morning air. A man straightened from a crate and raised his hand in greeting. Silas nodded back. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Further along, near the bench overlooking the water, Eleanor Brooks sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was dressed neatly, her posture upright, her cane resting beside her rather than beneath her weight. She had regained much of her balance over the months, but more importantly, she had regained trust in her own body. When she saw Silas and Hawk approach, she smiled and lifted her hand in a small wave. "You're early," she said. Silas smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." Eleanor chuckled. "Some habits don't leave us." Hawk paused briefly at her side, lowering his head just enough to acknowledge her presence. Eleanor reached out and rested her hand lightly on his shoulder, her touch gentle and sure. She did not linger. She did not need to. As Silas and Hawk continued on, the harbor path widened, opening toward the community clinic where the room by the water waited. The door would open soon. The chairs would be set as they always were. People would arrive without announcements or expectations. Some would speak, some would not. All would be received. Silas no longer thought of it as something they had built. It was something that had grown around them, shaped by time and repetition rather than intention. He had learned that the most lasting things often arrived that way. A young man jogged past them, slowing instinctively as he drew near. His name was Caleb Wright. He no longer carried the sharp edges that had once defined him. His stride was relaxed now, his shoulders looser, his breath even. He gave Silas a nod as he passed, then glanced at Hawk. "See you later," he said. Silas nodded. "We'll be there." The words felt ordinary. That was what made them powerful. They reached the end of the path and turned back toward the town, the sun now higher, the light stronger, but still gentle. Silas felt the quiet satisfaction of familiarity settle into his chest. This road no longer led him away from anything. It led him through. There was a time when Silas had believed worth was measured by speed, by precision, by the ability to move ahead of fear. That version of himself felt distant now, not lost, but completed. He did not miss it the way he once thought he might. What had replaced it was not smaller. It was simply different. Hawk slowed for a moment, sniffing at the edge of the path, then lifted his head and resumed his pace. Silas adjusted instinctively, their steps aligning again. They had learned this rhythm together, through pain and patience, through loss and repetition. It no longer required effort. As they neared the clinic, a woman stood outside the entrance, hesitating. She was in her early 40s, average height, her posture guarded, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes moved constantly, as if unsure where to settle. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed leaving the house more than once before actually doing it. Silas slowed. "Doors open," he said gently. The woman looked at him, surprised by the lack of expectation in his voice. Then her gaze dropped to Hawk, who had sat down without being told, his attention steady but non-intrusive. She exhaled, just once. "Okay," she said, as if answering herself. Silas watched her step inside. He did not follow immediately. He gave her space. He had learned the value of that too. When he entered a few moments later, the room had already begun to fill. The familiar faces were there. New ones too. Hawk lay down near the window, his breathing slow and even. Silas took his seat, back supported, hands resting loosely in his lap. No one called the meeting to order. Silence settled, not awkward, not empty, but ready. Silas looked around the room and felt something settle into place that no diagnosis or conclusion had ever given him. This was not a second chance. It was a continuation, a path that had not existed until he and Hawk had been forced to slow down enough to see it. Later, when the room emptied and the day moved on, Silas and Hawk stepped back outside. The sun was high now. The harbor buzzed softly with life. The path waited. They walked it again, slower than most, steadier than ever. They were no longer men or dogs defined by what they could no longer do. They were defined by what remained, by the willingness to show up, by the quiet strength of staying. People would come to this road for many reasons, some to heal, some to remember, some simply to begin again. Silas and Hawk would be here, walking forward, together. Sometimes God does not take away the pain. He gives it meaning. Silas and Hawk were not saved by becoming strong again. They were saved by being present, by staying, by walking forward together. If you feel broken or left behind, remember this: God can still use you right where you are. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. May God bless everyone who is still walking forward. If you believe this comment, amen.